I'm going to be talking about legitimacy. So for about 15 years now, I have been studying issues related to legitimacy. I started by looking at the role of legitimacy in political violence and contentious politics, but have eventually, through that process, the work has evolved to looking at issues related to measurement, theorization, and conceptualization of legitimacy more broadly. And I've written and published a number of articles that dig into some of the various themes. And a lot of this has sort of been my way of trying to grapple with a very large literature that spans multiple disciplines, which has caused me a very large amount of confusion. And so in the process of trying to make sense of questions like what is legitimacy, how does legitimacy work, how do we measure it, things like that, I have come to some conclusions that I'm reasonably happy with, and so I'm putting them together into a book. And what I'm going to talk to you about today are some of the core ideas and arguments in this book project that I'm working on right now, titled Legitimacy, a Relational Perspective. So because I'm talking about some of the core ideas from work in progress, I'd especially appreciate questions and comments during the Q&A. I welcome those. But before I dive into actually talking about the research itself, let me just motivate for you a little bit. Why should you care about legitimacy? So legitimacy, whoops, there we go. This is a cluster on the politics of inequality. And legitimacy has for a long time been understood as a critical dimension for understanding how inequalities persist and are maintained over time. So take, for example, consider two different systems of status inequality. We can think about meritocracy, or we can think about a racial caste system. Both of these systems constitute frameworks for determining the unequal access to and unequal distribution of resources in society. I assume I'm not going to ruffle any feathers by saying that I'm guessing most of us would argue that meritocracy is a more legitimate system of inequality than a racial caste system. Now, when we think about the legitimacy of these systems, legitimacy helps to, it is associated with maintaining support for them, with reducing opposition, for acceptance, approval, things like that. And so when we have a system of inequality, which we have a lot of different systems that produce these unequal distributions of resources, when we have one that's legitimate, if a problem comes up with it, we're more likely to try to resolve the problem as opposed to abandon the system altogether or to oppose it, right? So we all know that there's lots of research increasingly showing that test scores are as much an indicator of ability as they are of class and racial background. Grades can be problematic indicators. These are used as meritocratic indicators, but rather than abandoning meritocracy altogether, what we have done, because this system is widely considered to be generally legitimate, is try to come up with other ways of measuring merit or resolving these issues. So we have legitimacy sort of at the core of maintaining systems of inequality, but it's also implicated in how people oppose or mobilize against inequalities. We can think of illegitimacy as a necessary but insufficient condition for political mobilization. This is something that a lot of my earlier work on contentious politics and political violence looked at, the role that legitimacy played. And legitimacy is often viewed as a key for the success of movements that are trying to overturn certain inequalities. So you have to have some degree of legitimacy more broadly, things like that. So this is the basic pitch for why are we talking about legitimacy, and why has decades of scholarship been talking about legitimacy in the context of the politics of inequality. And arguably, I'm hoping that this might indicate it's something we might want to pay attention to. But there's a problem. It's really unclear what the heck legitimacy is. So if you think about it, legitimacy can mean a lot of different things. And if you look across the literature, which I started to do, and that's where the confusion began, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And it has, depending on how we think about and conceptualize legitimacy, it can have dramatically different implications. So I think that this is particularly well illustrated by some of the ways that we measure legitimacy in empirical research. People have used indicators like of acceptance, of approval, of support, of obedience, etc., as indicators of the same basic construct, right? So we've got lots of indicators of one concept. But if you were to conceptualize, for instance, legitimacy in terms of obedience to an unequal system, that's going to look really different than approval of an unequal system. And we see both of these things playing out. So obeying a system of inequalities looks really different than supporting, which might be illustrated by voters rallying around political candidates who are advocating for unequal treatment within a polity based on, say, race, ethnicity, citizenship status, or gender. And so legitimacy can start to look really different and mean very different things depending on how we're conceptualizing it and measuring it. So, over the past few years, I have been trying to make some sense of what legitimacy is, how it works, and how it matters. And in trying to look for areas of agreement and consensus across this literature, I have arrived at what I refer to as a relational understanding of legitimacy. So in the course of this talk, my goal is to make the argument that legitimacy is best understood as a quality of relationships. What I mean by this is that legitimacy should be understood not as a property or an attribute of an entity. It's not something that you just have. And it's not solely a judgment of some audience. Instead, I argue that legitimacy should be understood as a quality of the relationships between the object of legitimacy and a particular audience. Consequently, rather than saying that, for instance, a social movement or a system of rewards distribution has legitimacy, we would say that the social movement or the system of rewards distributions benefits from legitimacy in its relationship with a particular audience, so it's relationship specific. Now, conceptualizing legitimacy in relational terms has a variety of implications, and I want to walk through some of them today. So first, it has really important implications for measuring legitimacy. So as I said before, measurement strategies play a huge role in how we theorize this construct. And well, I think most people are likely able to get on board with the idea that legitimacy is a part of relationships. This is not how we measure it. And I think that adopting a more relational approach to measurement can be a little bit more challenging and a little bit more controversial. So I am going to introduce a conceptual framework that I have developed for how we measure legitimacy in a relational context and talk through the implications of thinking relationally for measurement. I also want to talk about the implications of a relational perspective for how we think about the effects of legitimacy, how it matters and what it does. And then the last part that I'm going to talk about is what I'm really kind of chewing through right now while I'm here, which is the idea that adopting a relational perspective on legitimacy kind of implies a broader relational ontology. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, and then I'll welcome your questions, feedback, and pushback on these ideas as I move forward a little bit. All right? All right. So without any further ado, the argument. As I mentioned a moment ago, legitimacy has been defined in a lot of different ways that vary both within fields of study and across fields of study. So to illustrate this, let me show you just a few definitions of legitimacy that I pulled from major review articles on legitimacy across multiple disciplines. So first we have this definition by Tom Tyler, who defines legitimacy in the Annual Review of Psychology as a psychological property of an authority, institution, or a social arrangement that leads those connected to it to believe it is appropriate, proper, and just. In the Annual Review of Sociology, Catherine Johnson, Tim Dowd, and Cecilia Ridgway review 7 different definitions of legitimacy, including this one by Berger and Luckman, who say that legitimacy is a process by which cultural accounts from a larger social framework in which a social entity is nested are construed by others to explain and support the existence of that social entity, whether the entity be a group, a structure of inequality, a position of authority, or a social practice. In the Annual Review of Political Science, Risa and Stoltenberg define legitimacy simply as the right to rule. Right? That's pithy. I got a lot of words, and then you just got 4. That's much easier. And then in the Academy of Management Review, Mark Suchman, in what is arguably the most widely cited at this point, I think it's averaging about 2,000 citations a year. It's up to about 27,000 right now. His article on legitimacy, and it's often cited for its definition, which is legitimacy as a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, values, beliefs, and definitions. So that's a mouthful. The right to rule is probably easier, but We'll pick them apart, right? So these different definitions represent just some of the many ways that legitimacy has been defined. And in an article that I published in 2022 in the American Sociological Review, I compared some of these major reviews of the scholarship on legitimacy that were published in the preceding 25 years in the fields of criminology, legal studies, management and organizational theory, political science, psychology, social psychology, and sociology. And as I show in this table, all but one you can see over here, I'm going to use the laser pointer. You can see over here, they all cite multiple definitions of legitimacy. Oh, well, all but one of them cite multiple definitions, ranging from 2 different definitions to up to 7. Now, on its face, this might suggest that legitimacy is an extremely heterogeneous concept. But what I wanted to see is, what do all of these definitions have in common? Are there any points of consensus where we can all agree that these are some basic building blocks of legitimacy? And when I started to look into these multiple definitions, what I found is that there were, in fact, some common patterns. So let's start with the basics, the empirical components of legitimacy. So at this most basic level, these definitions either clearly identified or implied 3 empirical elements for legitimacy. The first is an object of legitimacy. As Berger and Luckman write, this could be a regime, a cultural object, an action, a particular social arrangement, a system of inequality, something like that. But whatever it is, legitimacy tends to be associated with some sort of an object. The second empirical element is an audience. There has to be someone, something, some group of people that confer legitimacy. So these definitions consistently specify or allude to, and even in the right to rule, someone has to confer that right. You know, unless you believe in divine rights, but even divine rights are conferred by, something, right? So there's some external object which perceives, construes, confers, or believes something about the object. We've got these 2 nodes here. And then finally, there's a tie or a relationship between the two, the actor, the object, and the audience, which is defined by some set of expectations. So if you think about what a relationship is, there's a lot of literature on this that looks at just what constitutes a relationship. And a relationship can be boiled down to the presence of expectations. If you think about what is a friendship, it is reciprocal expectations between 2 people. The definition of a marriage is a set of expectations that define the meaning of interaction between 2 people. And so we have a tie that connects these 2 nodes. And this is commonly referred to, Mark Suchman talks about norms, values, beliefs, and definitions. Berger and Luckman talk about a cultural account. But we have these are 3 empirical dimensions, 2 nodes and a tie, right? Okay, now, at the same time, while we have these 3 basic empirical dimensions of legitimacy, these definitions imply that they interact in some systematic way. Now, again, you saw there are a lot of different definitions, so the degree to which they're elaborating this mileage varies, right? But there is an implication that the object of legitimacy is subject to evaluation by the audience. At the same time, the tie is defined by the presence of expectations. These expectations are a really important part of what constitutes legitimacy, some shared system of meaning. And then the audience's evaluations are intended to be based on the object's actual or perceived conformity to those expectations. So we wouldn't say that something is legitimate if, an audience perceives, makes an evaluation, there's a set of expectations that defines the relationship, and then the object goes and violates all of those expectations. So, if we have a meritocratic system and then someone gets hired outside of the merit, like through nepotism, we wouldn't call that legitimate. It's violating those expectations. So, taken together, these commonalities across definitions show us that legitimacy is really operating at this level of relationships between the object and the audience. Reinforcing this idea in his much-cited review of the literature on legitimacy, Mark Suchman writes that legitimacy is simultaneously a reaction of observers and it is possessed objectively. Now, this is a kind of paradoxical statement, but it starts to make a lot more sense if you think of legitimacy as existing in the relationship itself, as a quality of the relationship. It is neither just possessed objectively nor a perception. It's embedded in this transactional dynamic between 2 nodes. So this is my basic point of departure for thinking about legitimacy. It's my main argument that legitimacy is not just a reaction of the audience, nor is it just an attribute or a property of the object. It is a quality of the relationship between them. So hopefully this is not too controversial. While I think this is generally how we discuss legitimacy, it conforms with a lot of definitions. It does have a variety of both methodological and theoretical implications if we're willing to follow this through to its logical conclusion. And so I'm going to talk through some of those. The first implication is that conceptualizing legitimacy in these relational terms has really important implications for how we measure the construct. So returning to those review articles that I showed you the table of before, in addition to exploring the definitions of legitimacy, I also use those review articles, which I think, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head. I think it was a little over 1,000 non-redundant citations that they covered, spanning almost a century. So it's a lot of literature that they're kind of pulling together and reviewing. And they talk about empirical examples. And so I coded these reviews for discussions of how people studied legitimacy, how they measured it. And what I found was that there are three pretty common approaches to measuring legitimacy. The first measures legitimacy as an orientation of an audience. And so this is consistent with the idea that legitimacy is just a reaction of observers. The second approach to measuring legitimacy focuses on an alignment between the object and some set of expectations. For instance, a researcher might say that a regime is legitimate if it meets certain criteria for how it came to power, or a system, a rewards distribution is legitimate if it aligns with the system of meritocracy. I would say that, a regime is legitimate if it was democratically elected, meeting those expectations. The third approach to legitimacy, or to measuring it, is via evidence of acceptance or recognition. For example, we might say that a state is legitimate because its boundaries and its basic existence are unquestioned, or a particular economic system or a political system, like capitalism or democracy, that they are legitimate simply because they're just widely accepted. They exist and people aren't questioning their existence. So these three definitions, or these three approaches to measurement, are all grounded in theory. They are all directly linked to definitions of legitimacy. However, as I mentioned earlier, there are theoretically very consequential differences, which I contend are actually rooted in the fact that each one of these implies a very distinct unit of analysis. When legitimacy is measured as an orientation of an audience, the analysis treats individuals as the unit of analysis. When it measures legitimacy as an alignment between the object and the expectations, then the object's the unit of analysis. And when measurement centers on widespread acceptance or recognition, then the unit of analysis tends to be the social field or the environment. And these differences in unit of analysis wind up shaping our theoretical and substantive conclusions in really significant ways. So for example, we might consider the very, just basic question, how does legitimacy occur? Well, if we were to approach this question from the perspective of the individual, right? We take the individual as the unit of analysis, then the way that we're looking for causes of legitimacy are causes that affect the individual, that affect perceptions. We might look at the attributes of the audience themselves, features of the social environment that influence them, other factors like that. We're going to wind up with an explanation for the causes of legitimacy that are rooted in individuals. In contrast, if we focus on the object as the unit of analysis, we're going to look for causes in the attributes or behaviors of the object. For instance, if we want to know how an organization became legitimate, we're going to assess their actions and behaviors and then evaluate whether or not they align with expectations. Finally, if the field or the social environment is the unit of analysis, we tend to look for causes of legitimacy at the level of fields. And so what we wind up with is, just as an artifact of our measurement strategy, three theoretically incompatible approaches to answering the exact same basic question. So the unit of analysis is doing a lot of work here that I don't think we mean for it to do. And most of us, I think we can agree from our methods training, it's not ideal to take artifacts of our methods and use those as the basis for all of our theorizing. It's not usually how it's taught, right? So what's the solution? Well, if we accept that legitimacy is in fact relational, which, reasonable minds can disagree, but hopefully I've convinced you of, then arguably the answer that arguably legitimacy should be measured in the context of relationships. And I've developed what I refer to as a dyadic approach to operationalizing legitimacy. So given the importance of units of analysis, the question that I started with was what unit of analysis can simultaneously account for all three of the empirical components implied by definitions of legitimacy: an object, an audience, and a connection. And the answer to that is a dyad. A dyad accounts for all of these dimensions, but as a single unit. It's not three separate units, it's a unit unto itself. Now, the dyad, by focusing on dyads, I have illustrated in my past work that you can measure legitimacy by you can assess the presence or absence of legitimacy empirically based on the presence or absence of three necessary conditions. So these are the presence of expectations, which define the relationship, assent to the relationship by the audience, and conformity to those expectations by the object of legitimacy. Now, these necessary conditions are derived from definitions of legitimacy, and they suggest how the object and audience interact. So I'm just going to elaborate on each one of these a bit. Expectations generally just define the relationship that binds two nodes. Relationships can be multiplex, so it's necessary to identify the content of a particular relationship. So, for example, citizens have complex and sometimes contradictory relationships with the state. So when we're talking about state legitimacy, we need to define the aspect of the relationship that's relevant. And the relationship to the state as provider of welfare systems is different than the relationship to the state as a military force or a user of violence. Similarly, in a more quotidian way, my spouse and I are both faculty in the same department. So our relationship, two nodes, the same two nodes, very different relationship when we're in the office as opposed to at home. Right? And so when we talk about legitimacy, when we talk about legitimate behavior, when we think about evaluating in this context, it's important to not just focus on an object, but to really privilege that relationship. What is it? Because legitimacy, behavior that I might engage in at home that is legitimate there might not be legitimate in the office. The behavior of a state in the context of providing welfare might not be legitimate in the context of war. So this idea of focusing on relationships is really important, and arguably without any relationship, there are no expectations. And so if we think about the absence of expectations, if we're trying to understand where does legitimacy occur, if there are no expectations, then legitimacy simply won't exist. There's no relationship there. So this is why expectations are, I would call, a necessary condition for legitimacy. It's a necessary condition for relationships. Now, the second condition is assent, which I define as agreement with, approval, or support of a relationship by the audience. Now, assent is intended to capture this idea that legitimacy is a positive orientation, but it's specifically, I specify it as specific to the relationship. So instead of it being an evaluation of the object, it's an evaluation of the particular relationship with the object. And again, this speaks to that multiplexity of relationships. We can have a single object that's multifaceted, and that object isn't necessarily going to possess legitimacy in its entirety. It's going to be specific to a particular tie. And then the third component is conformity. Now, legitimacy is generally evaluated on the basis of an object's perceived conformity to expectations, or its observable conformity. So we can imagine this context where in some cases we can see that an object is behaving in the way that it should. We can see that a hiring system is working as it's meant to. We can see that an organization is living up to its standards and meeting quality criteria. But in some cases we don't have that basis of ground truth. We can't observe, and so it's based on perceptions. Oftentimes these should align, but a lack of alignment between them can undermine the sort of relational benefits of legitimacy. So this is a qualification on that, but this is the basic idea of conformity. Now, here's just a nice visual representation of, we have, again, using the pointer, 3 empirical dimensions, and then the role that these necessary conditions play. So the object conforms to expectations, expectations are the relationship, and then the audience assents to the relationship. Now, I argue that in conjunction, these 3 necessary conditions are sufficient for establishing legitimacy. While any one of these conditions might be an indicator of legitimacy, and in past research has been used to indicate legitimacy, each one of them independently leaves open the possibility that we're actually measuring something quite different. For example, reciprocal expectations, absent any evidence of assent, might simply be evidence of what Shelley Carrell and her colleagues refer to as illegitimate third-order beliefs, such as gender biases or systems of racial oppression. Similarly, research that shows assent, absent clear expectations or conformity by the object to expectations, might actually be evidence of a crisis of legitimacy, as indicated by Hall, Zuckerman, and it doesn't matter. Anyway, 2017 paper in the American Sociological Review, not remembering off the top of my head. Finally, measuring legitimacy via conformity without any evidence of assent risks conflating legitimacy with just passive acquiescence or tolerance. If, we have, let's say an organization says, here, I'm conforming to expectations, but everybody's like, that's not what we want, we're not going to call that legitimate. However, together, each one of these conditions allows us to rule out alternate explanations and establish evidence of legitimacy. So, this is the relational approach to measurement. It's a little bit more complicated. It moves beyond this, approval, obedience, acceptance framework, but it fits within this relational framework. Now, the second, beyond measurement, adopting a relational perspective on legitimacy also has implications for how we understand legitimacy's effects. So while the nature of the debates vary a great deal across substantive areas, there are in fact really rich debates about whether legitimacy is causally relevant for explaining certain social phenomena. Legitimacy is often invoked to explain outcomes from the onset of revolution to the market valuation of companies. However, many scholars have criticized these legitimacy-based explanations on multiple grounds. Some have argued that the explanations simply fail to account for more pressing material causes, and others have argued that legitimacy is just simply too intangible to provide a meaningful explanation for an outcome. And I actually think these debates are really nicely encapsulated in the multidisciplinary field of revolutionary studies. Now, revolutionary studies is a field that I've engaged with to some extent in my work on contentious politics. And it's commonly understood as having gone through 4 different generations. We're currently in the 4th generation of revolutionary studies, or 4 generations, waves, distinct waves, generations. And in each one of these generations, in each one of these waves of scholarship on revolutions, people have made the assertion that legitimacy is critical for understanding the onset of revolutions, and people have contested that assertion. So summarizing the critiques of legitimacy-based explanations of revolution, Colin Beck writes that history is full of numerous examples of regimes that were believed to be popularly illegitimate, but they persisted. So I would argue that these debates have remained stagnant across 4 generations of scholarship, largely because they consistently rely on an understanding of legitimacy that is primarily rooted in this idea that it's an attribute of objects, which in this context, it's an attribute of the political regime itself. When legitimacy is treated as an attribute, we logically focus on its growth, its loss, its erosion, and then we think of it as being an independent variable that affects the object directly. Now, in contrast, a relational perspective directs attention to how legitimacy affects specific relationships. So, rather than seeing a loss of legitimacy as causing regime collapse, a relational perspective views a loss of legitimacy as undermining the specific relationship that legitimacy is embedded in. All regimes will necessarily have multiple relationships, from international relations to the regime's cadres to various portions of the general population. And consequently, the extent to which illegitimacy in a particular relationship actually affects an outcome like regime collapse is dependent almost entirely on the extent to which that audience, the particular audience in the relationship, is in the position to have an effect on that outcome. Now, to illustrate this idea, former grad student Rob Vandenberg and I published a paper on this, looking at the role of legitimacy and illegitimacy in the end of the National Party regime in South Africa, the apartheid regime that lasted for more than 50 years, maintaining the system of racial oppression. Now, the reason that we started looking at this was that there was an extensive collection of literature positing that the regime fell because of its illegitimacy. Even Nelson Mandela wrote in his autobiography that it was the illegitimacy of the regime that ultimately led to its collapse. But we were looking at this, and it seemed kind of paradoxical to us, because here's a regime that for more than 50 years had never once had the popular support of the majority of the population in South Africa. It was a minoritarian repressive regime. Where's the legitimacy? It had faced a transnational social movement opposed to apartheid and was facing sanctions from the overwhelming majority of the world. And so the idea that illegitimacy led to the end of this regime assumes that at some point they had legitimacy. And it was not in any way evident where that legitimacy was coming from. So how do we reconcile really smart people who were a part of this movement making the claim that a loss of legitimacy mattered with the fact that it never seemed to have legitimacy to begin with? And so what we looked at in our research was what kind of legitimacy was it depending on? And it really boiled down to a couple of key specific relationships that the regime was depending on, the National Party depended on for its survival. It's relationships in the international arena with the United States and the United Kingdom. It's relationships at the domestic level with business leaders and with academics. So there was a tripartite system of education, and the apartheid system was designed by social scientists in South Africa to sort of be a maximally effective system of oppression. And so they depended on these systems for the maintenance of the apartheid system in South Africa. However, over time, the relationships with the National Party regime started to adversely affect the audiences that the regime depended on the most. And therefore, they started to weaken their relationship, or the legitimacy embedded in those relationships started to falter. The expectations started to change. The beliefs about what was appropriate, that whether or not the regime was conforming to those beliefs, started to be undermined. And so, as a result, those particular relationships withdrew support. And the literature, the secondary literature, but also the historical literature, indicates that it was this collapse of support at the domestic level among business leaders and academics, and at the international level in terms of in particular, the passage of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act that was passed in the United States in the 1980s, that ultimately led the National Party to initiate negotiations for a transfer to fully democratic elections in 1990. And so this relational understanding helps us to see how legitimacy matters. Despite the fact that it wasn't really there for a long time, it still seemed to play a role in the collapse of the regime. So the effects of legitimacy should be understood, I argue, in terms of relationships. All right, oops, we're almost done, I promise. All right, third implication. I am coming up on my time here, so I want to talk through this last implication, which is that adopting a relational approach to legitimacy, I think, implies a broader relational ontology, a relational way of seeing the world. Now, this is not something that I've explored in my earlier work, particularly the work on operationalization was intended to sort of be broad and applicable across a variety of ontologies and a variety of epistemological positions. However, if we take this relationality seriously, I do think that adopting a relational ontology does start to make a lot more sense. So what does this mean? Relationalism conceives of the social world as constituted by dynamic processes of connection and transaction, and it treats relationships as the focus of both theory and analysis. So I think that this position is really nicely and succinctly summarized by the first paragraph of Eric Wolf's classic book, Europe and the People Without History. And in the very first paragraph, he writes, "The world of humankind constitutes a manifold, a totality of interconnected processes, and inquiries that disassemble this totality into bits and then fail to reassemble it falsify reality. Concepts like nation, society, and culture name bits and threaten to turn names into things. Only by understanding these names as bundles of relationships and by placing them back in the field from which they were abstracted can we hope to avoid misleading inferences and increase our share of understanding." Now, relationalism is often contrasted with what Mustafa Emerbeyer terms substantialism, and this is a perspective that views the social world as consisting primarily of substances, things, beings, essences, and treats those substances as the focus of theory and analysis. Now, this is a very, very long way, rich tradition of thought. It's an old tradition of thought, substantialism, and it's rooted in Aristotelian thinking. So, as John Dewey and Arthur Bentley write in their book, Knowing and the Known, Aristotle's physics was a great achievement in its time, but it was built around substances. Down to Galileo, men of learning almost universally held, following Aristotle, that there exist things which completely, inherently, and hence necessarily possess being. That these continue eternally in action, movement, under their own power, continue indeed in some particular action essential to them in which they are engaged. And so a relational ontology contrasted with this substantialist mode of thinking encourages us to move beyond thinking about fixed entities as static units in the social world and focus on the relationally constructed and transactionally constructed units that are dynamic and that are dynamic across space and time. And so we can think about this. It implies an understanding of the social world that, again, is ontologically distinct. So first, it views social entities as constituted by the ever-changing roles that they play in relationships. So in the context of legitimacy, this implies that the object of legitimacy itself is not a stable, fixed entity. And the same with the audience. If we think about an audience, what constitutes a population? What constitutes, the relevant people who, would care about the legitimacy of an entity is constantly evolving through these processes of transactions. I think this idea of the relational construction of entities is nicely summarized by Harrison White in his book, Identity and Control. And here he uses the example of an internet forum to illustrate this idea. So he writes, you can create on an internet forum an account in order to participate and use it. It's not the mere subscription, but the posting that creates your identity in a forum while linking you by stories to others and their comments. You don't exist in the forum as a whole person, but as a user, contributing to the specific topic of the forum, for example, football or sociology. Since you can have accounts in many forums, you can switch between them, logging out of, say, the football forum so as to log into the sociology forum. The important point is that although you log out, your identity in that forum, your account remains, so your postings are not deleted by the logout process. In this sense, your activity has left a social trace consisting of ties with other entities in the forums. So this is how a relational perspective reconciles the idea that there is some stability, there are some basic elements that we can work with in society, but what constitutes them and their meaning is evolving and changing through the process of these transactions. At the same time, relationalism rejects universalism. There's a major emphasis in privileging of context. So rather than saying legitimacy works this way in all contexts, we would expect that legitimacy will function differently across different times and spaces. So for instance, thinking about the analysis that that Rob Vandenberg and I conducted looking at South Africa, we wouldn't necessarily expect, if you were to adopt a substantialist view and treat these as variables, we might say that legitimacy in international arena has a negative effect on the probability of regime survival. But that's a very substantialist way of thinking. It creates these entities with fixed attributes that we then look at how one impacts the other, and we make a universal claim. But relationalism encourages us to look in a more contextual way and actually identify the specific relationships and processes, the transactions that define these dynamics. Relationalism also takes seriously contingency and agency. And in this way, it aligns more closely with a view of the world as dynamic rather than fixed. And so, kind of bringing this back, I started with the question, what is legitimacy? And you can see the rabbit hole I've wound up down from there. But ultimately, in reviewing across these multiple disciplines, multiple fields across the social and behavioral sciences and the humanities, I've come to this idea that legitimacy is embedded in relationships. And if we follow this through, I think that it has much broader implications that arguably should shape the way that we study legitimacy. And then adopting this ontological perspective, winds up having implications for how we think about a variety of other things, including the politics of inequality. So that's where I'm going to end it today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.